The rain was pouring heavily that night when Daniel stood across the street, watching the woman he loved. Through the bright glass window of the restaurant, he could see her laughing. Sitting comfortably across from her was a tall man wearing a very expensive suit. The man leaned closer, saying something that made her smile even wider. Daniel's heart tightened. Just 3 days earlier, she had told him she was too busy to see him. But tonight, she clearly had time for someone else. Daniel slowly lowered his hood and stepped back into the darkness. The rain soaked through his cheap jacket, but he barely noticed, because what he was about to do next would change everything. You see, Daniel Okoye was not the poor delivery driver everyone believed he was. In reality, he owned one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country. His net worth was over $3 billion, but almost no one knew that, and the woman inside that restaurant. His girlfriend, Nadia, believed he was just an ordinary man, struggling to survive. Daniel sighed deeply. "Maybe this test has gone on long enough," he whispered to himself, but deep down, he needed to know the truth. Because Daniel had been betrayed before, years ago, another woman he loved left him the moment she discovered his wealth. She didn't leave because he was poor. She left because she found someone even richer. That day had changed him forever. Since then, Daniel had made a rule for himself. Before trusting anyone with his heart, he would first test their loyalty, and Nadia was now in the middle of that test. They had met 8 months ago at a small neighborhood cafe. Daniel had intentionally dressed like an ordinary worker that day. Old sneakers, a faded jacket. Nothing about him looked wealthy. Nadia had been sitting alone with her laptop, frustrated about something. When Daniel accidentally spilled coffee on his own shirt near her table, she burst out laughing. "Wow, that's impressive," she teased. Daniel chuckled nervously. "Yeah, I guess coffee and I are not friends." She offered him some napkins and helped him clean the mess. That was how everything started. Over time, their connection grew naturally. They went on simple dates, street food stalls, evening walks, cheap movie nights. Nadia never complained about his financial situation. In fact, she often encouraged him. "You're smart, Daniel," she once told him. "You just need the right opportunity." Those words meant more to him than she could imagine. But lately, something had changed. Over the past few weeks, Nadia had started canceling plans. She seemed distracted during conversations. Sometimes she didn't answer his calls. Daniel tried not to think too much about it. Until tonight, seeing her sitting across from another man, dressed in luxury, laughing like that. Something felt wrong. Daniel turned and walked away from the restaurant. But as he crossed the street, his phone suddenly vibrated. It was a message from Nadia. "Sorry, Daniel. I'm really busy tonight. Let's talk tomorrow." Daniel stared at the message. Then he slowly smiled. But it was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just made a decision. "All right," he whispered. "Let's see how far this goes." Because Daniel was about to take his test much further. And Nadia had no idea, not even close. The next morning, Daniel barely slept. All night, the image of Nadia sitting in that restaurant kept replaying in his mind. The way she smiled. The way she leaned toward that man. The way she looked comfortable. Too comfortable. Daniel sat quietly in his small rented apartment, staring at his phone. The place looked exactly like the home of a struggling man. Old furniture, a small fan in the corner, a cracked kitchen table. It was all part of the act. But today, something about the act felt heavier than usual. At exactly 9:12 in the morning, his phone rang. It was Nadia. Daniel looked at the screen for a few seconds before answering. "Good morning," she said softly. Her voice sounded normal, calm, almost sweet. "Morning," Daniel replied. There was a brief silence between them. "So, about last night," Nadia began. "I'm sorry I couldn't meet you. Work has been really stressful lately." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I understand." Another pause followed. For a moment, Daniel wondered if she would mention the restaurant. Maybe she would tell him the truth. But she didn't. Instead, She said something else. "Daniel, can we meet later today?" Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sure," he replied. "Where?" "Let's meet at the park, near the river, around 5. "All right." The call ended. Daniel slowly placed his phone on the table. Then he sighed deeply. She still didn't tell the truth. He murmured, across the city, in a massive glass skyscraper, Daniel's real world was waiting. An hour later, Daniel walked into the headquarters of Okoye Technologies. The moment he entered the building, the entire atmosphere changed. Employees greeted him respectfully. "Good morning, Mr. Okoye." "Morning, sir." Some even straightened their posture when he walked past. Here, Daniel was not the struggling delivery driver. Here, he was the billionaire CEO. Inside his office on the top floor, his assistant Grace was already waiting. Grace Mensa had worked with Daniel for 6 years. She was sharp, observant, and one of the few people who knew about Daniel's strange habit of testing people. She handed him a tablet. "You asked me to investigate the man from the restaurant," she said. Daniel took the tablet calmly. "Already?" Grace nodded. "His name is Victor Adewale, 38 years old, real estate investor. Very wealthy." Daniel scrolled through the information. Photos appeared on the screen. One of them showed Victor getting out of a luxury car. Another showed him attending a high-profile business event. But the next photo made Daniel stop. Victor, standing beside Nadia. Not last night. A week ago. Daniel slowly looked up at Grace. "You're sure about this?" Grace nodded again. "They've met several times recently." Daniel leaned back in his chair. His jaw tightened. "So this isn't the first time." Grace hesitated before speaking again. "There's something else." Daniel looked at her. "Victor has a reputation." "What kind of reputation?" Grace crossed her arms. "He dates women, shows them luxury, expensive gifts, trips, and then disappears." Daniel stared at the tablet. "So, he's a player." Grace shrugged slightly. "More like a collector." Daniel exhaled slowly. The room fell silent. After a moment, Grace asked the question that had been on her mind. "Are you still planning to continue this?" Testania stood up and walked toward the large glass window overlooking the city. Thousands of people moved below, like tiny dots. "Yes," he said quietly. Grace frowned. "Daniel, what if you're wrong about her?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Then he said something unexpected. "I hope I am." Later that afternoon, Daniel arrived at the Riverside Park. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the water. Nadia was already there, sitting on a wooden bench. When she saw him approaching, she stood up quickly. "Hey!" she said, smiling. Daniel studied her face carefully. She looked exactly the same as always. Warm eyes, gentle smile. But today, Daniel noticed something new. She was wearing an expensive dress, the kind she normally never wore. "You look nice," Daniel said. "Thank you," Nadia replied. They sat down on the bench together. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Nadia took a deep breath. "Daniel, I've been thinking a lot about our future." Daniel raised an eyebrow. She nodded. "You're a wonderful man. You're kind, hard-working, and you always try your best." Daniel listened quietly, but then Nadia said something that made his chest tighten. "But sometimes, love alone is not enough." Daniel slowly turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" Nadia looked down at her hands. "I want stability, Daniel. I want a better life. I don't want to struggle forever." Daniel's voice was calm. "So you think being with me means struggling forever?" Nadia didn't answer right away. Then she whispered something that cut deeper than she probably realized. "I met someone recently." Daniel already knew the name, but he still asked, "Who?" Nadia swallowed nervously. "His name is Victor." Daniel nodded slowly. "I see," she continued, speaking quickly. "He's successful, confident, and he's offering opportunities that you can't give me right now." Daniel stared at the river in silence. The sound of water gently hitting the shore filled the air. Finally, Nadia said the words Daniel had been dreading. "I think we should take a break." Daniel looked back at her, for the first time since they met. His expression was impossible to read. "Are you sure?" he asked calmly. Nadia nodded. "I think it's best." Daniel stood up slowly. "All right." Nadia looked surprised. "You're not angry?" Daniel shook his head. "No." He gave a small smile. "I just hope he makes you happy." Nadia looked relieved. "Thank you for understanding." Daniel turned and began walking away, but as he reached the end of the park path, he pulled out his phone. He sent one message to Grace. "Prepare Phase 2, across the city." In his luxury office, Grace read the message. Her eyes widened, because she knew exactly what that meant. Daniel's test was no longer about patience. Now, it was about the truth. And the truth was about to destroy someone. The next few days were painfully quiet. Daniel didn't call Nadia, and Nadia didn't call him either. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like their relationship had simply faded away. Two people going their separate ways. Nothing dramatic, nothing complicated. But inside Daniel's mind, a storm was building. Every detail of Nadia's words kept replaying. "Love alone is not enough. I want a better life. He's offering opportunities you can't give me." Daniel stood inside his penthouse office late one night, staring down at the glowing city below. From this height, the city looked peaceful, almost innocent. But Daniel knew better. Money changed people, sometimes slowly, sometimes instantly. Behind him, the office door opened quietly. Grace walked in, holding a folder. "Update," she said. Daniel didn't turn around. "Tell me." Grace placed the folder on his desk. "Nadia and Victor have been spending a lot of time together." Daniel remained silent. "They've gone to 3 expensive restaurants this week," Grace continued. "Victor also bought her a designer handbag yesterday." Daniel finally turned. "Already?" Grace nodded. "And tonight, they're attending a private party." Daniel walked toward the desk and opened the folder. Inside were several photos. One showed Nadia stepping out of a black luxury car. Another showed Victor placing his hand gently on her back as they entered a hotel. Daniel stared at the images for a long moment. Then he closed the folder slowly. "Good," he said. Grace raised an eyebrow. "Good?" Daniel's voice was calm, almost cold. "The faster this happens, the clearer the truth becomes." Grace studied his face carefully. "You don't look surprised." Daniel gave a faint smile. "I stopped being surprised by people a long time ago." Later that evening, Nadia stood in front of a large mirror inside her apartment. Her heart was beating fast. She carefully adjusted the elegant black dress Victor had bought her earlier that afternoon. The fabric shimmered softly under the light. It was easily the most expensive thing she had ever worn. For a moment, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. "Wow," she whispered. Just then, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Victor. "My driver is outside." Nadia grabbed her purse quickly. Excitement rushed through her body. Everything felt different now. Exciting, glamorous, powerful. When she stepped outside her apartment building, a sleek luxury car was waiting. The driver opened the door politely. "Good evening, Miss Nadia." She smiled nervously and stepped inside. Across the city, Daniel sat quietly in the back seat of another car. But his car wasn't going to the party. It was parked across the street from Nadia's apartment building. Daniel watched silently as Victor's car pulled away with Nadia inside. He leaned back slowly. "So," he murmured, "that's her choice." His driver glanced at him through the mirror. "Sir," Daniel shook his head slightly. "Nothing." But deep inside, something painful shifted in his chest. He had hoped, even just a little, that Nadia might hesitate, that she might think about him. But the excitement on her face when she entered Victor's car, that excitement told him everything. Meanwhile, The party Victor was taking Nadia to was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The event was held in a massive luxury mansion on the outskirts of the city. Bright lights illuminated the garden. Luxury cars filled the driveway. Elegant guests walked around holding glasses of champagne. Nadia stepped out of the car slowly, trying not to look overwhelmed. Victor walked toward her with his confident smile. "You look stunning tonight," he said. Nadia blushed slightly. "Thank you." He offered his arm. "Come, I want to introduce you to some important people." Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was glamorous and loud. Music played softly in the background. Businessmen, celebrities, and influencers mingled together. Nadia tried to stay calm as Victor introduced her to several guests. "This is Nadia," he would say proudly. And every time, people smiled politely. But after an hour, something strange began to happen. Victor slowly started disappearing. At first, it was just short moments. "I'll be right back," he told her. But each time he returned, he stayed for less time. Eventually, Nadia found herself standing alone near the balcony. The music played, people laughed, but no one spoke to her. She looked around for Victor. He was nowhere to be seen. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Finally, Nadia stepped outside onto the balcony for some fresh air. The night breeze was cool against her skin, but just as she was about to pull out her phone, she heard voices nearby. Victor's voice, and another man. Nadia froze. "Another one already?" The man laughed. Victor chuckled casually. She was easy. Nadia's heart stopped. The other man asked, "How long do you think this one will last?" Victor shrugged. "Maybe a week, maybe 2. The men both laughed. "Then what?" the friend asked. Victor took a sip of his drink. "Then I move on to the next one." Nadia felt her chest tighten. Her hands started trembling. Everything suddenly felt cold. The expensive dress, the luxury car, the glamorous party. It all felt like a cruel joke. But before Nadia could process everything, her phone vibrated. A message appeared on the screen. Unknown number. Her heart pounded as she opened it. The message contained only one sentence. "Be careful who you trade real love for." Nadia stared at the screen in shock. Then a second message arrived. This one included a photo. Her breath caught in her throat because the photo showed Daniel. But not the Daniel she knew. In the picture, he was standing inside a massive corporate office, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. Behind him was a golden nameplate on the desk. Daniel Okoye. Nadia's entire body went numb. And in that moment, she realized something terrifying. The man she had just abandoned was far richer and far more powerful than Victor could ever be. Nadia stared at the photos on her phone. Unable to breathe, the image showed Daniel standing confidently inside a massive office. Behind him were glass walls overlooking the entire city. The elegant desk, the luxury interior, the golden nameplate. None of it looked fake. It looked powerful, it looked real. Her fingers trembled as she zoomed in on the nameplate again. Daniel Okoye, CEO. Her mind refused to accept it. No, this can't be right, she whispered. But deep inside, something told her the photo wasn't lying. Just hours ago, she had broken up with Daniel because she believed he was poor. Now she was staring at proof that he might be one of the most powerful men in the city. Her chest tightened painfully. "What have I done?" Se murmuré. Inside the mansion, the party continued like nothing had happened. Music played. People laughed. Glasses clinked. But Nadia suddenly felt like she didn't belong there anymore. She walked quickly back inside, her eyes searching for Victor. It didn't take long to find him. He was standing near the bar, laughing loudly with a group of friends. Nadia approached slowly. "Victor!" she said. He turned casually. "Oh!" His voice sounded relaxed. "Almost Boreth." Nadia held up her phone. "I need to ask you something." Victor glanced at the screen. His eyes narrowed slightly. Then he looked back at her. "Where did you get that?" "Answer the question," Nadia insisted. "Victor Siger." "That's Daniel Okoye." "I know his name," she said nervously. "But who is he really?" Victor chuckled. "You're serious?" Nadia's heart was pounding. "Yes." Victor leaned against the bar. "He owns Okoi Technologies." Nadia felt dizzy. "One of the biggest tech companies in the country," Victor continued. "The guy's a billionaire." The word hit Nadia like a physical blow. Billionaire. Her mind raced through every memory she had with Daniel. The simple clothes, the small apartment, the cheap restaurants, the long walks instead of expensive dates. It all made sense now. Daniel had been pretending, testing her, and she had failed. Victor watched her expression carefully. "Why are you asking about him?" he asked. Nadia swallowed. "Because he was my boyfriend." Victor blinked. For a moment, he looked genuinely surprised. Then suddenly, he burst out laughing. "Wait! You're serious?" Nadia felt tears building in her eyes. "Yes." Victor shook his head in disbelief. "You dumped a billionaire. For me?" The men around him started laughing too. Nadia felt her face burn with humiliation. Victor wiped tears of laughter from his eyes. "That's incredible." Nadia stepped back slowly. Everything felt overwhelming. The music suddenly sounded too loud. The lights felt too bright. She turned and walked quickly toward the exit. Behind her, the laughter continued. Outside, the night air felt cold and heavy. Nadia sat on the mansion steps, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "The truth always reveals character." Nadia whispered softly. "Daniel." Tears rolled down her cheeks. Across the city, Daniel stood in his penthouse living room. The lights were dim. The city skyline glowed through the massive glass windows. Grace stood nearby, watching him carefully. "She received the photo," Grace said. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes." Grace crossed her arms. She also heard Victor talking about her. Daniel didn't look surprised. "I expected that." Grace studied him. "You planned all of this?" Daniel turned toward her. "Yes." Earlier that evening, Daniel had arranged everything. Grace had hired someone at the party to subtly guide Nadia toward the balcony. Another person made sure Victor and his friend stood nearby. The message had been sent at exactly the right moment. Every piece had been carefully placed, not to hurt Nadia, but to reveal the truth. Grace sighed. "Daniel, you didn't just test her." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Grace looked him directly in the eyes. "You destroyed her illusion." Daniel walked toward the window again. "I didn't destroy anything," he said quietly. "I just removed the mask." Grace hesitated. "Do you still love her?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He stared at the city lights for a long moment. Then he spoke softly. "I did." The room fell silent. But then Daniel's phone rang. Grace glanced at the screen. "It's Nadia." Daniel looked down at the phone. Her name flashed across the screen, calling. Grace waited. "Are you going to answer?" she asked. Daniel stared at the phone, thinking, after everything that had happened tonight, this call meant something. It meant Nadia had discovered the truth. But the question was simple. Did she regret losing Daniel? Or did she regret losing his money? The phone continued ringing. Once, twice, 3 times. Finally, Daniel answered. He didn't speak first. On the other end, Nadia's breathing was shaky. "Daniel, please. We need to talk." Her voice cracked with emotion. Daniel closed his eyes, briefly. "What about?" he asked calmly. Nadia hesitated. Then she whispered something that filled the room with tension. "I know who you really are." Daniel's expression didn't change. "I see." There was a long silence. Then Nadia said something unexpected. "I didn't leave you because you were poor." Daniel opened his eyes slowly. "Oh!" Nadia's voice trembled. "I left because I thought you were hiding something." Daniel's eyebrows slowly tightened. "What?" Do you mean? But Nadia's next words would change everything. Because what she said next was something Daniel never expected to hear. "Daniel," she whispered, "I knew you were lying to me. Long before tonight." Daniel stood frozen in the quiet penthouse living room, Nadia's words echoing in his mind. "I knew you were lying to me. Long before tonight." For the first time since this entire test began, Daniel felt uncertain. Grace, who had been standing nearby, noticed the change in his expression. His calm confidence had disappeared, replaced by something rare. Confusion. Confusion. Daniel spoke slowly into the phone. "What do you mean you knew?" On the other end of the line, Nadia took a shaky breath. "I noticed small things," she said. "Things that didn't make sense." Daniel walked toward the large window, staring into the glowing city lights as he listened. "At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it," Nadia continued. "But the more time we spent together, the more obvious it became." Daniel remained silent. "Daniel, poor people don't talk the way you do." Grace raised her eyebrows slightly. Nadia continued softly. "You understood business strategies, investments, market trends. Sometimes you would say things that sounded like you were running a company." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "And that made you suspicious." "Yes. But instead of asking me," Daniel said calmly, "you decided to leave me for Victor." There was a pause. "No," Nadia said quietly. "That's not the real reason." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then what is on the other end?" Nadia's voice trembled again. "Because I thought you were ashamed of me." Those words hung heavily in the air. Daniel slowly turned away from the window. "What?" "I thought you were pretending to be poor, to see if I was good enough for you," Nadia said. Grace's eyes widened. Daniel said nothing. Nadia continued explaining. "You always paid attention to how I reacted to money. When we walked past expensive stores, you watched my face. When we talked about success, you carefully listened to my opinions." Daniel felt a strange chill run through his chest. He had been observing her the entire time, but somehow she had been observing him too. "I thought you were testing me," Nadia said. Daniel's voice became quiet. "And that made you leave?" "No!" Nadia's voice cracked. "I left because I was tired of feeling like I was under investigation." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "I wanted honesty," she whispered. "I didn't want to be part of a test." Grace slowly sat down on the couch, listening carefully. Daniel took a deep breath. "So, instead of confronting me, he said, you chose to date Victor." Nadia sighed. "I didn't know who he really was at first." Daniel shook his head slightly. "But you liked his money." "Yes," Nadia admitted quietly. "At least I thought I did." Her voice grew weaker. "But tonight, I realized something." Daniel didn't respond. Nadia continued. "Victor doesn't see people. He sees trophies." Daniel remembered the recording Grace had shown him earlier. Victor's careless laughter. "Maybe a week, maybe 2. I heard him talking tonight," Nadia said. "I know." Those 2 words shocked her. "You know?" Daniel sighed. "Yes." There was a long silence. Then Nadia asked slowly, "Did you plan that?" Daniel hesitated. Grace watched him carefully. Finally, Daniel answered. "Honestly, yes." Nadia inhaled sharply. "So, the messages, the photo, everything." "Yes." Another silence followed, but this one felt heavier. Nadia whispered, "Why?" Daniel's voice carried years of pain. "Because I needed to know if you loved me, or my money." "But you never gave me the chance to choose," Nadia said softly. Daniel didn't answer. After a moment, Nadia spoke again. "There's something else you should know." Daniel frowned slightly. "What?" Her voice became serious. "The man you think you were testing tonight wasn't the only one testing someone." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Nadia took a deep breath. "Victor didn't randomly approach me," Daniel felt a sudden tension rise in his chest. "What do you mean?" Nadia answered slowly. "He approached me because someone told him to." Grace immediately sat upright. Daniel's voice turned sharp. "Who?" Nadia hesitated. "I don't know his name." Daniel's patience was disappearing. "Nadia," she continued quickly, "but I know what he looks like." Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Grace. "Tell me," he said. Nadia's next words sent a shock through the room. He was an older man. Gray hair. Very confident. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. "He said he was an investor." Grace whispered quietly. "Daniel," but Nadia continued speaking. "He told Victor that dating me would be an opportunity." Daniel's voice became cold. "An opportunity for what?" Nadia answered with one sentence that made Daniel's stomach tighten. "To get close to you." The room went completely silent. Grace slowly stood up. "Daniel, there's only one person who fits that description." Daniel already knew, because there was only one man powerful enough and cruel enough to manipulate people like that. Daniel spoke the name quietly. "My uncle." Across the city, in a luxurious office filled with antique furniture, an older man sat comfortably in a leather chair. He swelled a glass of expensive whiskey as he watched a security video playing on a screen. The footage showed Daniel leaving his penthouse earlier that evening. The old man smiled slowly. "You're still too predictable, Daniel." Behind him stood Victor, nervously waiting. The old man turned slightly toward him. Everything went exactly as planned. Victor nodded. "Yes, sir." The old man chuckled softly. "Good." Then he looked back at the screen, his eyes cold and calculating. "Because now, Daniel will finally learn what betrayal really feels like." Daniel stood motionless in his penthouse as Nadia's words echoed through the room. "Your uncle." For a long moment, no one spoke. Grace slowly walked closer, her face tense with concern. She had worked with Daniel long enough to know that his uncle was not just a family member. He was an enemy. "Daniel," Grace said carefully, "if he's involved in this, then none of this was random." Daniel nodded slowly. "I know." On the phone, Nadia sounded nervous. "I didn't understand it at first," she said. "Victor told me a businessman approached him a few weeks ago. He said there was a wealthy CEO who needed to be emotionally distracted." Daniel's jaw tightened. His uncle had always been ambitious. Too ambitious. For years, the older man had tried to gain control of Okoye Technologies, claiming that Daniel was too young and inexperienced to run the company. But Daniel had fought back, and he had won. At least, that's what he believed. Until tonight, Grace crossed her arms. "He wanted to break your focus," she said quietly. Daniel nodded again. Yes, his uncle knew Daniel's biggest weakness. Trust. If Daniel became emotionally unstable, distracted by heartbreak and betrayal, it could affect his decisions in business. And in the world of billion-dollar companies, one mistake was enough to destroy everything. But Daniel suddenly realized something strange. If my uncle planned this, he sighed slowly, then why expose Victor's true behavior tonight? Grace thought for a moment. Then her eyes widened. "Because he wanted Nadia to come back to you." Daniel looked at her. Grace continued, "If you believe she betrayed you for money, and then suddenly realize she regrets it, it creates confusion." Daniel understood immediately. Confusion created emotional weakness, and emotional weakness created mistakes. Nadia spoke again on the phone. "Daniel, I'm really sorry. I should have been honest with you from the beginning." Daniel's voice soft, slightly. "I should have been honest too." There was a pause. Then Nadia asked the question she had been afraid to ask. "Do you hate me?" Daniel stared out at the city. "No." Her voice trembled. "Do you still love me?" Daniel took a deep breath. That's not a simple question. Across the city, inside the luxurious office, Daniel's uncle was still watching the security footage. The older man smiled confidently. "Soon," he murmured, "very soon." But what he didn't know was that Daniel had already understood his plan. Back in the penthouse, Daniel turned to Grace. "Prepare the board meeting." Grace blinked. "Tonight?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Grace smiled slightly. Now she understood. Instead of becoming weak, Daniel was about to turn the entire situation into an advantage. 2 hours later, the executive board of Okoye Technologies gathered inside the massive conference room. Several investors and directors sat around the long table, and at the far end, Daniel's uncle sat calmly, pretending to look surprised by the sudden meeting. Daniel entered the room wearing a sharp, dark suit. The atmosphere instantly shifted. He walked to the head of the table and looked around at everyone. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice." His uncle leaned back in his chair. "What is this about, Daniel?" Daniel pressed a button on the remote in his hand. A large screen behind him lit up. Security footage appeared. It showed Victor entering the office of Daniel's uncle. Weeks earlier, the room erupted with murmurs. Daniel's uncle's smile slowly disappeared. Daniel spoke calmly. "I recently discovered that someone attempted to manipulate my personal life in order to influence the leadership of this company." The directors looked shocked. The footage continued playing. Now it showed Victor receiving instructions. Money changing hands. A clear plan forming. Daniel looked directly at his uncle. "Would you like to explain this?" The old man's face turned pale. For the first time in years, he had been caught. Several board members began whispering angrily. One of them spoke loudly. "This is unacceptable." Another added, "Attempting to sabotage the CEO is grounds for immediate removal." Daniel remained calm as the room filled with tension. Finally, the board chairman stood up. "Mr. Okoye," he said firmly to the uncle, "you are hereby removed from the board, effective immediately." The old man stared at Daniel with burning hatred, but there was nothing he could do. Security escorted him out of the building. And just like that, the most dangerous threat to Daniel's company was gone. Later that night, Daniel stood alone by the river where he and Nadia used to walk. The city lights reflected softly on the water. A few minutes later, Nadia approached slowly. She looked nervous, but she stopped beside him. "Hi," she said quietly. Daniel no head. "Hi" for a moment. They simply stood there. The wind moved gently across the river. Finally, Nadia spoke. "I never cared about luxury before, Victor," she admitted. "But when I saw that world, I got curious." Daniel listened quietly. "But tonight, I learned something important," she continued. "What?" Nadia looked directly at him. "Money reveals people, but it doesn't change who they really are." Daniel smiled slightly. "That's true." She hesitated before asking one final question. "So, what happens now?" Daniel looked at the river for a moment. Then he answered honestly. "We start again." Nadia blinked in surprise. But this time, Daniel continued, "No lies, no tests, no pretending." A small, hopeful smile appeared on her face. "Deal." They stood there together, watching the water flow quietly through the city, and Daniel finally understood something he had been searching for his entire life. Trust cannot be tested forever. At some point, it simply has to be given. And sometimes, the greatest test of all is learning how to forgive.